It's late. The office is quieter than usual, only the occasional sound of keys being typed in the distance, the hum of the lights above, and the ticking of a clock. Sarah sat at her desk, eyes tired, the dark circles under them telling the story of many sleepless nights. Her work had become her life, the only thing she could rely on in a world that sometimes seemed too chaotic to understand. The deadline was looming, but she couldn't let it get the better of her. She needed this promotion, needed it to prove that she could make something of herself, that she could rise above the role they'd slotted her into. The sharp, echoing click of dress shoes against the polished floor brought her attention to the door. Without looking up, she knew who it was. The sound was unmistakable. Mr. Carter, her boss, the one person in this company who wielded enough power to destroy anyone's career with a simple word. A man who had every single person in the office eating out of his hand. It was his charm, his confidence, his ability to make people feel like they were special, like they were part of something bigger, something important, and Sarah had never been immune to it. "Still here, huh?" came his deep voice, full of amusement and something else. Something darker that Sarah had learned to notice but never dared confront. She forced a smile, keeping her gaze trained on the screen. "Almost done," she said, her fingers still typing away, despite her mind being elsewhere. He stood there for a moment, watching her with those calculating eyes, as if he was looking through her, past her, straight into the heart of whatever was hidden beneath the surface. "I like that about you," he said. "Your determination. You're one of the few who actually cares about the work." The words felt heavier than they should have. Sarah felt a tightness in her chest, a flutter she couldn't quite explain. She didn't answer. It wasn't necessary. She had learned long ago that in the world of business, words could be weapons. And when Mr. Carter spoke, every word was deliberate, designed to make his mark. He took a few steps closer, his shoes clicking louder, louder than the usual rhythm that followed him. "You know," he said, his voice lowering, becoming more intimate, "I admire your work ethic. It's rare to see someone who wants it as badly as you do." Sarah shifted in her seat, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. Her breath quickened, but she kept her gaze forward. "Thank you," she muttered, still not looking at him. She didn't want to look at him. The longer she did, the more she felt that strange pull, that gravitational force she couldn't escape. "You don't have to thank me," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "I think you're the kind of person who deserves more than just a pat on the back. You deserve to be rewarded." Sarah's fingers stopped typing. The sentence was too ambiguous. The implication was too much. She slowly lifted her eyes to meet his, and when she did, she saw the way he was looking at her. It wasn't professional. It wasn't even the way a superior might look at a subordinate. No, it was something far more dangerous. It was the look of someone who knew they had power over you, who knew how to use it. For the briefest moment, Sarah felt a surge of something, fear, desire, something she didn't understand. She quickly turned back to her screen, her hands gripping the edge of the desk, trying to steady herself. I should finish this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But he wasn't leaving. She could feel him there, standing too close, too silent, his presence suffocating her. He hadn't moved, hadn't said another word, and yet the tension in the air was so thick she could almost touch it. "Why rush, Sarah?" His voice was softer now, almost coaxing. "You've been working so hard. Don't you think you deserve a little break?" Her heart pounded in her chest, and she hated herself for the way her body betrayed her, for the way it responded to him even though every logical part of her screamed to resist. She couldn't tell if he was flirting, manipulating, or something darker. But in that moment, she wasn't sure which one terrified her more. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice trembling, "I really need to get this finished." He ignored her, reaching over her desk to casually brush a strand of hair from her face. The touch was almost too gentle, too intimate. Sarah froze, unsure of how to respond, unsure of whether she even wanted to. "You're so beautiful when you're focused," he said, his words slow, deliberate, like they were meant to sink into her very bones. She pulled back instinctively, her breath catching in her throat, but he was already moving, stepping back, his eyes still on her. "I know you want this, Sarah," he said, his tone darkening. "I can see it in your eyes. I can feel it when I'm near you." She stared at him, her mind racing, her hands shaking. He was close enough now that she could smell the faintest trace of his cologne, could feel the heat of his body radiating toward her. "You're wrong," she whispered, even though she wasn't sure she even believed it herself. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile, and turned toward the door. "I guess I'll leave you to it then," he said, his voice taking on that cool, confident tone she knew so well. But there was something else in it now. A hint of something that made her skin crawl. Something that made her wonder whether she'd ever really been in control of the situation to begin with. As the door clicked shut behind him, Sarah exhaled, her body trembling. She had no idea what had just happened, but she knew this. Things were never going to be the same. She was no longer just a hardworking employee to Mr. Carter. She was something else now, something he wanted, and she didn't know how much longer she could resist. Sarah sat frozen for a moment, staring at the door after Mr. Carter left. Her thoughts were a blur, a twisted knot of confusion and desire. She wanted to be angry with herself, angry that she couldn't push away the feeling that lingered in the air, a dark pull she couldn't quite define. She wanted to feel disgust, to tell herself that she was imagining things. But there was a tiny, insidious voice deep inside her mind that whispered something else, something she didn't want to admit. What if he was right? What if she did want this? The thought made her stomach churn with unease. She wasn't some easy conquest. She wasn't the type of woman who gave in to a superior's charm and power just because they offered her a taste of something forbidden. But then why did she feel this way? Her hand clenched around the edge of the desk, her pulse quickening as she thought back to his touch, the way his fingers brushed so casually against her hair, like he had all the time in the world to make her feel small, yet special at the same time. She shook her head, forcing herself to focus, pushing the thought away, but the lingering tension remained, thick in the air. The next day passed in a haze of half-finished thoughts and uneasy glances. Sarah found herself watching the clock, counting down the hours until the end of the day, just to escape the oppressive atmosphere that clung to the office. But no matter how much she tried to focus on her work, she couldn't escape the pull of Mr. Carter's presence. It was like he was everywhere now. She couldn't avoid him forever. By late afternoon, her instincts told her he was watching. She felt the weight of his gaze on her, as if it were a physical presence. She glanced up from her computer screen to find him standing in the doorway of her office, his silhouette casting a long shadow in the dim light. His smile was small but undeniably knowing, like he had some secret that only he understood. "You seem distant today," Mr. Carter said, his voice low and almost teasing. "Are you still thinking about our little chat last night?" Her heart skipped, and she swallowed hard, trying to suppress the shiver that ran down her spine. There was no way he could know, right? There was no way he could sense the chaos swirling inside her. I'm fine," she said, forcing the words out, her voice cracking slightly. She cleared her throat, pushing herself to sound more confident. "Just busy with some work, nothing more." But he didn't seem convinced. He stepped into the room slowly, his eyes fixed on hers, and for a moment she felt like she couldn't breathe. "Sarah," he said softly, "I think you're lying." The words sent a cold shiver through her. How could he be so sure? How could he read her like that? She wanted to look away, but her body refused to obey. His gaze held her captive, pulling her deeper into whatever game he was playing. "You know," he continued, his voice smooth like velvet, "it's not a crime to want more than what you have. You've been working so hard, but it doesn't have to be all about work, does it?" His words were like a whisper against her skin. She could feel his presence so close now, like he was inside her thoughts, manipulating them with every syllable. Her mouth went dry and she found herself swallowing again. I don't know what you mean, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled then, and it was the kind of smile that made her feel like she was the only person in the room. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "Don't play coy with me, Sarah," he said, stepping even closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "You felt it too, haven't you? The way the air changes when we're in the same room? The way your heart beats faster when you see me? It's not just me, is it?" The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She felt exposed, naked in front of him, even though she wasn't. There was no way she could deny it anymore. There was no point in pretending she didn't feel the attraction, the undeniable pull between them. But the realization made everything more dangerous. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him to stop, to get out of her head. But the desire that had been simmering inside her couldn't be ignored anymore. Her body betrayed her again, her breath quickening, her heart pounding faster. He leaned in, close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His lips were just inches from her ear, and she could almost feel the words before he spoke them. "You don't have to be afraid of it, Sarah," he murmured. "You don't have to fight it. We both know what's between us, and you don't have to pretend it's not real." Sarah closed her eyes, her body rigid with the conflict between her desire and her fear. How had it come to this? How had she allowed herself to get tangled in his web? "Mr. Carter," she whispered, her voice shaking, This isn't right." His breath ghosted over her ear as he pulled back slightly, just enough to look her in the eyes. He smiled again, this time colder, more calculated. "Right or wrong, it doesn't matter anymore, Sarah. What matters is that you know what you want. And I know what you want too." She took a step back, the room spinning around her as she tried to collect her thoughts. She could feel her pulse in her throat, the raw need inside her warring with the logic that screamed at her to leave, to run. But even as she took a step away from him, she knew she wasn't really leaving. He was right. She was already in too deep. The tension between them was now, but the words sounded weak even to her own ears, because deep down, she knew she was lying. She wanted him to take control, even just for a moment. He smiled, an almost knowing smile. "You say that, but I can see it, Sarah. You're not as indifferent as you want everyone to believe." His voice dropped a little lower, making the space between them seem even smaller. "You know, I see a lot of potential in you, not just as a worker, but as someone who could have everything you want. You just have to trust me." Sarah shook her head, trying to shake the image of what he was implying, but the words sank into her chest like stones. She was afraid to acknowledge what he was saying, afraid that it might be true. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached down, pulling the chair across from her out from under the desk. He sat, but not too far from her. The proximity made her uncomfortable in the best and worst of ways. "Doing what?" he asked, the playfulness in his voice belying the seriousness of his words. "I'm just offering you something more. You've worked so hard, Sarah. You deserve more than this endless grind." Sarah's breath hitched. She knew he was talking about something more than just her career now, and she hated herself for the part of her that wanted it. "But you don't know what I deserve," she said, trying to make her voice sound firm, though it faltered under the weight of her emotions. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know exactly what you deserve, Sarah. You just haven't figured it out yet." There it was again, that dangerous, tantalizing promise. She could feel herself slipping further into the storm, yet part of her wanted to dive in. She could almost hear him, his voice in her head, tempting her, telling her that she wasn't enough on her own, that she needed him, needed what he could offer. But the other part of her, the rational part, screamed to stop, to get away before it was too late. "I don't need anything from you," she managed, though the words felt empty as soon as they left her mouth. He gave a soft chuckle, his gaze growing more intense. "I think you do, Sarah. You just don't want to admit it. You don't want to admit that you're tired of being alone, of carrying all of this weight by yourself." She clenched her fists under the desk, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to shout at him, to tell him to stop playing with her, to get out. But instead she sat there, frozen by the unrelenting pull of his words. "I'm not," she began, but he interrupted her, his voice low, almost gentle. "Just listen to me for a moment," he said. "You don't have to do everything alone. You've been working so hard, but I can see the way it's wearing on you. I can see the cracks, Sarah. Let me help you. Let me show you how much more there is, if you just stop fighting it." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, her heart thudded painfully in her chest, and she felt a surge of something she couldn't identify. It was as if he were unraveling every defense she had left, slowly, piece by piece, and she couldn't stop him. Sarah sat in silence, the air thick between them. Every word he spoke, every glance he gave her seemed to strip away her control, leaving her vulnerable, exposed. She felt like a prisoner in her own body, caught between her own desires and the fear that she was losing herself. Mr. Carter didn't speak for a while, just sat there watching her with that same knowing smile, his gaze steady, unrelenting. It was as though he knew she could no longer escape the web he'd so carefully spun around her. He had already won, even if she didn't know it yet. Finally, he stood up, slowly, deliberately, and walked over to the window. The office lights outside flickered, casting shadows on his face. He turned to look at her one last time. "You don't have to decide right now," he said softly. "But know this, Sarah, whatever you choose, it won't change the way I see you. You've got potential. You just need to trust that I can help you unlock it." Her heart hammered in her chest as she stared at him, his figure framed by the window's dim light. She was on the edge, teetering between the life she had known and the unknown abyss he was offering her. His words had dug into her like a splinter, and now she couldn't pull them out. The thought of giving in, of letting him guide her, was both terrifying and intoxicating. He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. "I'll let you think about it," he said, his voice a touch gentler now, almost like a whisper. "But don't take too long. Sometimes opportunities slip away before we even realize they're there." He opened the door, then hesitated, looking back at her. "Just remember, whatever happens between us doesn't have to be complicated. You're not alone in this, Sarah." With that, he left, closing the door behind him with a soft click. The silence in the room was deafening. The weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating her. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup, her mind racing. She had spent the last few days in a haze of confusion, constantly questioning her own desires and the power dynamics at play. But now, the truth was undeniable. She had felt the attraction, the pull, from the very beginning. She wasn't sure if it was the allure of the forbidden, or the power he wielded over her, or something else entirely. But now, she couldn't deny it anymore. She wanted him. And the realization sent a shock through her system. She had always told herself she was smarter than this, that she would never fall into the trap of being manipulated, of letting her emotions and desires cloud her judgment. But Mr. Carter was different. He knew exactly how to break her defenses, how to make her question everything she had once believed. And despite the warnings in the back of her mind, she found herself wanting to surrender to him. But what did that mean for her? What would happen if she did give in? Would she be the same woman afterward? Or would she be forever changed? She glanced at the door, as if expecting him to walk back in at any moment. But he didn't. The room was still. For a long time, she sat there, staring at the empty space where he had stood. The office around her felt cold, distant, and suddenly too small. She could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights, the occasional clink of keys from a few remaining co-workers down the hall. The clock ticked louder, marking the passage of time, and yet Sarah felt frozen, as if the world had slowed down just for her. Her mind kept circling back to his words. Whatever happens between us doesn't have to be complicated. But how could it not be? It was impossible to ignore the line between right and wrong, between professional boundaries and personal desires. She had spent her whole life building a reputation for hard work, for integrity. And now she was tempted to throw it all away for a man who seemed to hold all the cards. Her phone buzzed on the desk, interrupting her spiraling thoughts. It was an email, one that had come through earlier in the day, but when she opened it, she saw that it was a message from Mr. Carter. It was short, almost too simple. "I think you made the right choice last night. The offer still stands. Let me know when you're ready." She stared at the words, her finger hovering over the screen, torn. Every part of her knew that this could end badly, that she was playing a dangerous game, but the temptation was too great. She stood up suddenly, her chair scraping the floor. The office felt too small now, like the walls were closing in on her. She needed air. She needed to think. She needed to get out of here to escape the suffocating weight of her own thoughts. She grabbed her coat and left the office, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. The crisp night air hit her as she stepped outside, the cool breeze rushing past her. It didn't clear her head, though. It only seemed to sharpen the confusion swirling inside her. She needed to make a choice. She could either walk away and pretend nothing ever happened, or she could embrace the dangerous path that Mr. Carter had laid out before her. She didn't know which option would ultimately define her, but she knew this. Once she chose, there would be no turning back. As she walked down the street, her phone buzzed again. It was another message from him, this time with a single line that made her heart race. "Don't be afraid of what you want." The text lingered in her mind as she walked, the weight of his words pulling at her more than she wanted to admit. She stopped in her tracks, looking up at the darkened sky. The city was alive around her, bustling with people, but she felt completely alone. The choices ahead of her felt overwhelming, and yet she couldn't escape the nagging feeling that she was already too far gone. As she stared at the glowing screen of her phone, she felt a strange calm wash over her. There was no going back. Whatever happened, whatever she chose, this was the moment that would change everything. And for the first time in days, Sarah was ready to make that choice. She pressed the button to reply, her fingers trembling as she typed out the only thing she knew for certain. "I'm ready."